Hey everybody, today I'm gonna talk about God's Not Dead 2. Considering the commercial success of the first film, it should be no surprise that Pureflix produced a sequel. And to be clear, this movie does not disappoint. Just like any good sequel should, God's Not Dead 2 raises the stakes of the first movie but doesn't live in its shadow. Despite some surface-level similarities, the film is remarkably different from its predecessor. It has a different narrative structure, different characters, and it introduces a different, complicated set of rhetorical tactics. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about those things. As with my first piece about God's Not Dead, I don't have a clear, single-minded thesis that I'm going to follow. I just want to look closely at what G-Not D2 is trying to say and how it says it. I'm excited, honestly. This is gonna be a lot of fun for me. So, let's get started. Where the first God's Not Dead is sort of all over the place and wants to be a Love Actually style God romp, the sequel is much more focused. Sure, we get to see all our fave characters again. Chinese Jesus Man is there. Our cool ministers are there.
God is good.
All the time.
And all the time.
God is good.
But really, the brunt of God's Not Dead 2 centers around its main plot, a woman who talks about Jesus in the classroom and who goes to court to defend her right to do so.
I would rather stand with God and be judged by the world than stand with the world and be judged by God.
And considering how important this plot is to the movie as a whole, it's fortunate for us that it's just incredibly interesting, so much so that my discussion of it will span the entire video. The inciting scene of God's Not Dead 2 is a fascinating one. It starts with the protagonist, Miss Grace Wesley, talking to her class about Martin Luther King when her star pupil, Brooke, asks a Jesus question.
Isn't that sort of like what Jesus meant when he said that we should love our enemies?
Yes. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew records Jesus as saying, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you will be children of your Father in heaven," which indicates a commitment to nonviolence.
Because of the teacher's answer and the short conversation afterward, the school decides that what she did was bringing religion into the classroom and was thereby forbidden. This scene here sets a really strange plot in motion, and as such, I think it's worth spending a fair amount of time talking about how it works and what it's trying to do. On one level, the purpose of this scene is to give the secular world something to be awful and punitive about. Nobody in their right mind would ever try to make the claim that Grace is being too religious here. After all, Martin Luther King was a reverend, and so saying that he was inspired by the Bible isn't a religious claim, it's a historical one. So basically, this moment is a straw man building device. A Christian watching this movie is supposed to see this scene, rightfully think there's not much controversial about it, and then be primed to accept a narrative where the secular world is painfully antagonistic.
What were you thinking, Grace?
But there's another, more complicated thing this scene is trying to accomplish. See, the over-the-top policing that the ACLU perpetrates in this film doesn't happen a lot. It arguably never happens. So if the filmmakers just came in and said, what Grace does here is fine, everybody should agree with that, well, it would only be responding to a mythical, basically non-existent case. And the film wants more than that. It wants to make a broad statement about how the state punishes and over-regulates the Christian church, and so this inciting scene has to function on that level, too. There's some nagging sense of religiosity in the way this scene is constructed. Maybe it's that the music swells when Grace starts talking about Jesus. Maybe it's that she quotes just a tiny bit too much of the Bible, or that she explicitly holds Jesus up as a role model.
I, for one, am grateful for those that do. Those who stand up for what they believe.
These things don't change the literal composition of the scene, don't change the fact that no reasonable person would ever reprimand her, but they do create a feeling. They signal to the audience that this act is more meaningful, more religious than it has any right to be. And that's because Grace's actions don't just stand for Grace, they stand for all evangelical expression. The people opposing her are not just weirdo bureaucrats with too much time on their hands. They are embodiments of state-sponsored religious oppression.
I mean, aren't we allowed to say what we believe? When did that change?
I'm not going to argue with you.
It's no strange thing for a film or a scene to have both a figurative and a literal set of meanings. I'd say that's a natural predisposition of most media. But in the case of God's Not Dead 2, these meanings don't really play together well. If taken literally, this scene at the center of the film doesn't stand for anything. In fact, it intentionally stands for so little that anybody who opposes it looks like a strange D-bag. Taken figuratively, though, the scene must stand for everything. The entire fraught relationship between church and state. As such, this moment is rhetorically uncertain, both meaningful and meaningless. And we're gonna see, as we look through the rest of the movie, that this uncertainty is central to the way it constructs its message and gets us to believe what it wants us to believe. So, with all that in mind, let's jump into the meat of the movie. Grace Wesley v. ACLU. The antagonist this time around is Peter Cain, who also seems to understand the case as something which operates on two totally disconnected levels. On one hand, he's bound up with the literal meaning of Grace's actions. It's his job here to be the straw man, as he has to argue that what Grace does at the beginning of the movie is somehow out of step with U.S. educational practices.
Christianity is not on trial here, even though my opponent will try to convince you that it is.
But on the other hand, he's the classic secular monster that we saw in the first film. Cain's not just an atheist who's concerned with justice. Rather, he actively sees this trial as a way of killing God and all his associated religious influences.
We're going to prove once and for all that God is dead.
More than that, Peter is an embodiment of secular corruption. He gets Brooke's parents to testify against Miss Wesley by saying that their daughter will get into elite colleges if they do.
But next year, when you're applying to all the colleges, you'll be able to tell the story of how Brooke was part of a landmark constitutional case.
And considering how, anti-academia the first film is...
Today, we're gonna change things up a bit.
We can understand the fact that Cain represents that world as a signal to us that he holds superficial earthly gains over the Lord. And already, without any further analysis, we can see how Cain's role is a contradictory one. On the literal level, he's positioned against grace. He feels we should never, ever talk about Jesus in a classroom. But on a figurative level, he stands for elite, godless education. And, well, universities like Stanford and Harvard, they talk about religion. They have courses called Bible, Fact, and Fiction. I mean, I didn't take that class or graduate from Stanford, but the point is, they literally love this stuff. This might be a trivial contradiction when viewed in the full scope of the film, but I still think it's important. Because here, our antagonist is attacking something and defending it at the exact same time. He wants to preserve and represent secular education, but he seems to have no idea what that actually means.
Why do you think your parents are doing this? Because my mom thinks it'll help me get into Stanford or one of the Ivies.
So, we've hit a point where you're probably sort of concerned. Big Joel, you're probably saying. You've shown me how a contradictory rhetoric is embedded in this film, but then how do we make sense of it? How does God's Not Dead 2 read as something with a holistic message, even when it doesn't seem like there is one? And that's the question I'm going to spend the rest of this video trying to answer. To do that, we have to look at the trial itself. Since I was just talking about Peter Cain, let's start by examining the prosecution. In his opening statements, Peter lets us know what arguments he's capable of making and how those arguments are meant to be interpreted by the film's audience.
Now ask any fourth grader, and they're probably familiar with the phrase separation of church and state. Now, let me put it this way. I don't mean to offend anyone who may be a Muslim here, and I do not want to slight the Prophet of Islam, but if you were to ask me a question concerning the Quran, the sacred text of Islam, and I could come up with the answer with great speed and accuracy, and I could quote the proper surah or chapter, then it would be reasonable for you to infer that I was not only a follower of Islam, but that I considered it to be superior to all other forms of religion.
The argument here is actually a pretty coherent one. Cain begins with the assumption that the state shouldn't favor one set of religious beliefs over another, and that because of this, if Grace's actions were acceptable, their Muslim equivalent would also have to be acceptable. What's strange about these opening statements is that from a common sense perspective that's only concerned with the case at hand, the argument here isn't convincing at all. I said before that I don't think Grace's teaching was too religious for a public classroom. And as such, I think that if she had talked about, say, Malcolm X and his Muslim inspirations, that would have been fine. But if we see this movie from an evangelical perspective, one that holds that teachers ought to be able to bring more Christian values into the classroom, well, then these opening statements pose a pretty huge threat. Here's a question. Would God's Not Dead's general audience really accept a Muslim teacher quoting the Quran and holding up Muhammad as a role model? I don't think so. Looking at the first movie for a second, the creators don't seem all that keen on Islam.
You're beautiful. I wish you not to do that.
No, Mama, Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and He died to save me from my sins.
And as such, an evangelical who likes these movies a lot would have good reason to listen closely to Cain's argument. Because once the floodgates are open, that's it. If we want teachers allowed to say that God made the earth in 7 days, we also have to let them say that the Prophet Muhammad spoke to God. And, I don't want either of those things to happen, but I agree with the logic that says that if the former is permissible, the latter must also be. I don't know if the filmmakers feel the same way about that.
You're beautiful. I wish you not to do that.
It would be strange for a movie that seems to support the rise of Christianity in schools to make a point that problematizes that goal. So here, I want to make a suggestion. What if the audience isn't supposed to understand this scene on a broad level at all? What if they're supposed to watch it, think what I think about it, that it's not very good at convincing us to oppose grace, and then move on without considering how Cain's claim functions against a sweeping pro-Christian agenda? Peter Cain only ever touches on the literal dimensions of the case. Let's just go through his scenes one by one. It shouldn't take that long because they're all basically the same. In Cain's first witness interrogation, he talks to Brooke's parents about how upset they were that their daughter learned a thing about Jesus.
My wife and I are free thinkers. We're rationalists. We believe in a non-theistic worldview, and that's how we were trying to raise our daughter.
In the second, he talks to a fellow teacher who's just so annoyed at how Christian Grace is.
Everybody knows she's a Christian. I don't think she'd chew a stick of gum without praying first. It makes everyone feel awkward.
In the third, he talks to a member of administration who admits that Grace had the audacity to invite her to a church function.
And who was it that invited you to that service?
Grace Wesley.
And finally, in a climactic moment, Cain discovers that Miss Wesley had talked to her student about Jesus one time before.
I asked her how she kept it all together so well, and she said, Jesus.
All of these moments share two main characteristics. First, they're based in specific language and are intimately related to the case at hand. Second, because they're so rooted in Grace's circumstances, the points are totally flaccid. But now, let's juxtapose the tactics of the prosecution with those of the defense. From the very first words of the defense attorney, we'll just call him Scrappy, I don't want to look up his name, it's clear that what he's arguing for goes far beyond the literal court case in question.
I have here a copy of the Constitution of the United States of America and its Bill of Rights. But despite Mr. Cain's impassioned rhetoric, you know what you won't find in there? No matter how hard you look. The phrase, separation of church and state. Because that phrase comes from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson. Now, ironically, Jefferson was writing to a Baptist congregation, ensuring them that they would always have the right to believe as they wished, free of government interference. But lately, that phrase has been taken out of context and twisted and contorted to mean the exact opposite.
Here, it's not grace he's advocating for, but the idea that church and state should not be totally separate. It's not a surprise that Scrappy's argument falls flat here. First, while it's true that the phrase separation of church and state isn't present in our Constitution, its spirit is embodied by the Establishment Clause, which claims that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Second, Scrappy's claim that Thomas Jefferson's words have been contorted by modern society doesn't really work at all. Say what you want about Thomas Jefferson, I know I will, but the guy was pretty forward-thinking, and he was writing intentionally here. He recognized that the only way to protect the free expression of religion was to keep it out of the state's hands. Because if the government did sponsor one religion over another, then the unsponsored religions would necessarily suffer as a result. Anyway, what's important here isn't that Scrappy's arguments fail, it's that he's making them in the first place. The defense here has a golden case, one that rests on an attention to the specific things that Grace did and to the law. But as we've just seen, Scrappy is far less concerned with defending his client than he is with championing a cause for Christian presence in government institutions. And we're gonna see this tendency popping up in a lot of his arguments. See, there's 2 whole scenes devoted to expert witnesses vouching that Jesus was a real person.
Can you help me prove the existence of Jesus Christ?
Absolutely, beyond any reasonable doubt.
I determined that the 4 Gospels, written from different perspectives, contained the eyewitness accounts about the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
From the perspective of the case, Jesus' real existence could not be less important. Let's pretend for a moment that Jesus was never a person, that he's a total myth. Would Martin Luther King suddenly not have been inspired by the Bible anymore? Would the Declaration of Independence no longer have the word God in it? Would schools have to pretend that religion isn't important to history? No, of course not. So the only reason to bring up Jesus' historical life is to push the idea that teaching about Jesus in schools is always lawful. After all, the movie seems to say, if this Jesus guy existed, if he maybe said some stuff, then he's not really a religious figure, is he? And because of that, it's not just Grace's actions that should be excused, it's any teacher who explicitly invites Christian faith into the classroom. By the final courtroom scene, the point is clear. Scrappy harangues Grace into admitting that she has a personal relationship with God, and he proceeds to sarcastically make the claim that because she has faith, she should not be able to serve as a teacher.
I think it's time that we stop pretending that we can trust a person like this to serve in a public capacity. In the name of tolerance and diversity, I say we destroy her.
At this point, it's not about what Grace did anymore. Grace is just a symbol here, a stand-in for Christianity. Her trial is incidental, because now the film is centered around a question that nobody in the secular world ever asked. Should Christians be banned? They think they have a personal relationship with Jesus. Maybe we should ban them. About 3 hours ago, I presented a question that I wanted to answer. How does God's Not Dead 2 come across as though it has a holistic message when it's based in an uncertain, contradictory foundation? Well, I think the way the film negotiates this rhetorical strangeness is by dividing its conversation into 2 ideas that never really touch each other. If the evangelical audience wants to know the literal reason why what Grace did wasn't wrong, all they have to do is look at how lame the prosecution is, how they fail to convince us that she crossed any sort of line. But if the audience wants to engage in a more broad conversation about the general perceived persecution of Christians in America, or about why it might be okay to explicitly bring religion into public classrooms, they can look at the defense. They can see a series of arguments that aren't intimately related to Grace's case, but which suggest that there's been some unbalancing in America, some destruction of our national way of life and the beliefs that Christians hold so dear. The instability of law in this case, the way it attempts to be both literal and figurative in ways that simply do not work together, allows it to culminate in one ultimate message. What Grace did wasn't wrong. She was talking history, not religion. But if she were talking about religion, if she had brought Christ into the classroom, well, that would be okay too. So that's all I had to say about God's Not Dead 2. Hope that was fun for you guys. Now it's time for my Patreon question of the video. That's a thing I do now. Eliza Landers noticed that I wasn't that big in my Trash Day video and wants to know if my real name is really Joel. Well, hate to disappoint you, but no, it isn't. My real name is Henry, actually, so I'm neither that big nor Joel. I don't really know why I started using the name Big Joel. It just kind of puts a smile on my face for reasons I can't fully explain. So, hope you liked that answer there. Solve the mystery. And if you like the video as a whole, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.